Welcome back to the Curdverse. I'm Lisa Kaywood, corporate functionary by day, home cheesemaker by night. And this is Season 2 of Into the Curdverse podcast, a show for the curd curious. Whether you're just trying to figure out which cheese is what and what to choose for a dinner party, or you love science or little-known aspects of history, this show is for you. If you have a question about anything you hear, or maybe something you've always wondered about cheese but weren't sure whom to ask, there is a contact page on the Curdverse website. Last season, we covered most of the main cheese types made in Western Europe. This season, we'll go a little bit deeper into some regional specialties, as well as further afield, beyond Europe, and far back in time to the beginnings of cheese and its spread across Afro-Eurasia. This episode is about one of the best-selling cheeses in the world, cheddar. Not just cheddar, I'll also talk about its cousins, the Cheshires, the Leicesters, the Wensleydales. But there's a reason cheddar is the first thing everyone thinks of when it comes to British cheese, and why it's one of the most widely made cheeses in the world. It may also be one of the younger types of cheese in the world. The slightly crumbly, sharpish cheeses that we think of when we talk about this group of cheese really came into being in about the 16 and 1700s, and were very much shaped by the twin developments of capitalism and colonialism in that era. They were part of a low-grade trade war between Britain and New England starting in the 1700s, including the infamous triangle trade of the era. They were the main protein, besides salt pork and beef, on board British naval ships as England went off to colonize the rest of the world. And everywhere that Anglo-origin colonists became the majority, cheddar became the dominant cheese. It's still the most sold cheese in most of those countries today. You might be wondering how a cheese that had more or less just come into being would so quickly become such a dominant worldwide commodity. Why not the Wensleydales or Gloucester cheeses? Is it because cheddar is just the best cheese in the world? I'll admit that opinions may vary here when it comes to the ideal forms of cheeses, but in practice the answer is pretty clearly no. There are tons and tons of very underwhelming cheddar in the world, simply because of the vast scale at which most of it's produced. Cheddar spread, no pun intended, for the same reasons it came into existence. It was optimized around the sweet spot between consumer desirability, in terms of ample flavor and pleasant texture, and transportability. One could conceivably say it was specifically designed to be a good mass-market commodity cheese. In preparing this episode, I asked my youngest child, who is not a great fan of cheese and definitely not of cheddar, what of the million things I could say about cheddar I should talk about. They responded, "Why does it taste like that?" That meaning primarily the tanginess and somewhat crumbly texture. Both of those things are artifacts of the techniques used to make a reasonably moist yet long-aging cheese that can withstand a wide range of climatic conditions. So let's take a few minutes to talk about each of those techniques. By the way, this is going to assume that you've already listened to episode 2, in which I talked about the basic process of cheese making, from acidifying the milk to coagulating it, cutting the curd, and so on. If you haven't listened to episode 2, or it's been almost a year and you don't remember much, feel free to pause this here, go listen to episode 2, and come on back. Okay, so just to be clear, the techniques I'm about to talk about aren't used by all British cheeses by any means, but some combination of them is common in the type of tangy, slightly crumbly cheeses we're covering in this episode. Many of the British blues, most famously Stilton, also use these techniques, but are generally considered part of the blue family, not today's group of cheeses. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to refer to the non-blue cheeses that feature some combination of these techniques as British milled cheeses from here on out. All of these cheeses develop their flavor almost entirely in the pot. If you've ever heard the dictum, "cheese is made in the pot," it's attributed to a British cheddar maker named Joseph Harding. If you think back to various mold and service-ripened cheeses I talked about last season, even the natural rinds, everything about the flavor of those cheeses happens pretty slowly. The milk may be left to acidify for several hours, sometimes even overnight, before it's made into cheese. Pressed cheeses sit for several hours in the press, developing acid before they're salted, the salting being what stops the acid development. Softer cheeses drain for a day or two at room temperature, typically in the mid-70s Fahrenheit or low to mid-20s Celsius, before they're salted. And then what happens on the rind during aging contributes heavily to both the final flavor and the texture of the cheese. The British cheeses, by contrast, get to their desired acidity pretty quickly by keeping the curds warm, say 95 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 to 38 Celsius, for about an hour after they're drained. And then they're salted, stopping acid development, and pressed. In other words, the main part of the cheese's flavor is done before the curds ever go into the press, which is why you can eat fresh curds, a favorite of the upper Midwest of the US, and have them taste like something other than milky blandness. The flavor will deepen and the proteins will soften as the cheese ages, but the changes are relatively minor compared to what happens during aging with many other cheese types. The cheese is basically done in a day, and then stays quite stable with limited tending for months, even years afterwards. In other words, it's a very efficient cheese, and it lends itself well to high-throughput manufacturing. So what is a milled cheese? What is this milling? Well, it doesn't involve a large water-driven wheel turning a grindstone, but it does involve progressively breaking down your curds and making them smaller and smaller. With this technique, after you've initially cut the coagulated curd and stirred it in the warm whey for a while, you let the curds settle down to the bottom of the pot. At this point, the curds aren't cooked dry, but they've shrunk up, and the surface is wrinkly and a bit rough, kind of like Velcro. The rennet is still actively working too. So the curds really want to knit back together, and that's in fact what they start to do under the warm whey. They form into this pebbly slab. Milling occurs when you remove the curd slab from the whey and rip or cut it into pieces. This lets out some of the liquid whey that may be trapped inside the mostly but not entirely cooked curds. With British cheeses, milling is usually done 2 to 3 times while the curds are being kept warm. Now, Britain is not the only place where curd is milled. In fact, milling is a fundamental step in the process of making mozzarella and other stretched curd cheeses, going back many centuries. But of course, cheddar and its cousins have a very different texture than mozzarella, and that's because of the other techniques I'm about to mention. Okay, so the second technique is called cheddaring. Not all British milled cheeses include all portions of this step, but for those that do, it's an intermediary step that occurs while the drained curd slab is acidifying in the warm space before the final milling. So you take the slab out of the whey, you cut it in half, and then you stack those two halves one on top of the other. This does 2 things. The weight of the top log very gently presses more whey out of the lower curds over an extended period of time. And because this is happening in a warm space while the rennet is still active, the logs will kind of superficially knit back together. After a while, the logs are turned, cut again, and now the formerly lower slices are now stacked on top of the other ones. And this will happen a few more times while the curd is acidifying. So there's the regular cutting, turning, and partially reknitting going on, and that's what partly contributes to the crumbly texture of a traditional cheddar. The third process is interior salting. Again, this is not unique to British cheeses, but it's far more common in England than elsewhere in Europe. So, let's talk about salt. Salt serves 2 main functions in cheese. One, it kills microbes, both potentially harmful ones, but also the ones converting lactose to lactic acid. So salting a cheese brings that acidification process to a crawl. And 2, it helps pull liquid that might be lodged inside of the curd out to the surface. You've seen this same process called osmosis if you've ever salted cucumbers or eggplants or a steak. So it helps dry out the salted object. So when we apply salt directly to individual curds as opposed to the outside of a finished wheel, because those curds are relatively small, the salt penetrates all the way to the inside very quickly, and the curds shed yet another round of whey before finally going into the press. And they stop acidifying. So by now, much of the whey has been wrung out of the curds, and evenly so, that's the key. So when you finally go to press the curds together, you're really just smushing together a big pile of tiny, already basically stabilized cheeses. Again, there are British cheeses that include all of these steps but aren't pressed, so Stilton and the similar blue cheeses. We talked about this in episode 8, the blue cheese episode. Blue molds like acid and salt, but they also need air and moisture to bloom. So the cheese is allowed to keep those things after being put in the mold, rather than having the air and moisture pressed out. So these cheeses are normally considered part of the blue family, not grouped with the cheddars and the like, which are pressed cheeses. Interestingly, Wensleydales spent several centuries in the blue family. They were originally made with sheep milk, much like French Roquefort, and only started becoming more like other crumbly British milled cheeses in the 1700s. So now let's look at what all of that means for cheese portability. So cheese and other dairy products have been a primary food source for people on the move for literally millennia. Herders of all kinds across Afro-Eurasia have largely subsisted on milk and milk products for their own food and as trade goods since dairying began in the late Neolithic. Armies, from at least the ancient Hittites to the medieval Mongols to, yes, the 19th century Brits, have routinely issued cheese rations as a primary protein to their troops because it's lighter and in many cases more durable and less prone to spoilage than cured meats. And in a paper published in September 2021, a group of archaeologists of the ancient Eurasian steppe argued that dairying enabled the famous early Bronze Age migrations of the Yamnaya people from their home base just north of the Caucasus Mountains in southern Russia outward to Scandinavia in the west and Mongolia and the Altai Mountains in the east. The kind of cheeses I've talked about so far on this podcast, which are aged over weeks or months in cool, moist environments, depend on a particular climate and at least a seasonally sedentary lifestyle. So these are mostly not the kinds of cheeses that have historically been the mainstays of armies and colonizers. There are really two ways to deal with dairy if you're on the move. One is to bring your animals with you and have a lot of fermented dairy drinks, kefirs, drinkable yogurts, kumis, which you replenish each day as you milk your animals, along with a lot of quick fresh cheeses that you cook and eat the same day. The other is to squeeze all the moisture you possibly can out of the milk solids and carry what is effectively a rock-hard lump or bag of pebbly dried curds with you. And because rock-like things are hard to eat, they're typically soaked or grated into some kind of liquid and eaten as kind of a chewy mush. Nobody ever said a soldier's life was an easy one. Now, to be fair, Europeans have been shipping cheeses of all kinds around for centuries. And indeed, army supply wagons have long included large wheels of firm but not necessarily rock-hard cheeses. But the softer, more delicate cheeses rarely left their home regions. They were typically made on small farmsteads and used as rent payments to the local landlord when they weren't being eaten at home. Abbeys and large estates did produce large, firm cheeses for sale, but these too rarely traveled more than a couple of 100 miles at the most. And they traveled by a combination of land and river, not for weeks and months over thousands of sea miles in the very damp hold of a wooden sailing ship. So the age of intercontinental trade and imperialism called for a different kind of cheese. Either it had to be rock hard, or something else had to be done. So, the evolution of these cheeses into their present form actually started in response to commercial pressures in the domestic market within England, and as far back as the 1300s. I should mention for this section, I'm drawing heavily from Paul Kinstead's Cheese and Culture book. You can find a link in the resources section of the Curdverse website if you want to dig deeper. The shortish version goes like this. As London's population doubled and tripled every century between 1100 and 1700, the city had to reach further and further afield to provision its population. For dairy products, this initially meant Essex and East Anglia just northeast of London, about 2 days by boat up the coast. Now, East Anglia is naturally a big salt marsh. Sheep do reasonably well in salt marshes, and so not surprisingly, there were a lot of sheep, and a lot of sheep cheeses, especially in Essex. But they apparently weren't especially popular with people outside the region. They were impressively large, yes, and quite hard, so they traveled well, but they were also full of maggots. Perhaps something like Sardinia's infamous casu marzu. The maggots were presumably a feature to the locals, not just bugs, since the liveliness of Essex cheese is noted in texts across several centuries, from Piers Plowman in 1300s onwards. This was apparently not greatly troublesome to the British Crown, since Essex provided the army and navy with their hard portable cheese during the 100 Years' War. After all, everything else the common soldiers were fed had bugs in it too. but it appealed far less well to the civilian population of London. Now, starting in the 1400s, East Anglia got a series of seawalls, and some of the swamps were drained and land was reclaimed for agriculture, including grazing. Meanwhile, the London Cheesemongers Association had gotten official government recognition as a quasi-monopoly in 1377. And that gave the London cheesemongers a lot of power to bludgeon their suppliers into giving them what they wanted at prices they were willing to pay. And what the increasingly wealthy Londoners wanted was butter and good cheese. So sheep milk is very high in fat. It's got almost twice as much fat as average cow's milk. But unlike in cow milk, the cream doesn't readily rise to the top. So it's much easier and more economical to get butter from cow milk. So as you might expect, East Anglia began increasing its cow herds, especially as more and more land got reclaimed. But the hunger for butter, which paid relatively well, and still does by the way, meant that the milk left for cheesemaking had relatively little fat. There are cheeses that are deliberately made with at least part skim milk, Parmesan, for example, and many of the Alpen cheeses. These are, again, harder, long-aging cheeses. But they're not like the richer, more supple, full-fat cheeses available elsewhere in England. In the 1300s, most of London didn't really have much of a choice. Travel by land or sea was slow and dangerous. But 100 years later, shipbuilding technology had advanced quite a bit. By 1500, the Spanish and Portuguese were sailing around Africa and crossing the Atlantic. By 1600, they had circumnavigated the globe and had fully established regular trade routes for everything from sugar to porcelain and silk to slaves into the Americas from both Africa and Southeast Asia. So by 1600, getting semi-perishables like cheese from the further reaches of Britain down to London by sea was relatively feasible. In fact, hard cheeses from the continent, like Parmesan and Edam, were becoming fashionable in London, partly as cosmopolitan status symbols, and maybe also partly due to their relative lack of worms. All that was bad news for Essex and for East Anglia more broadly, but good news for regions like the northwest of England, which had developed a reputation for tasty and not-so-hard cheeses by this time. The Cheshire cheese of the time was pot-acidified and dry-salted, and formed into wide, flat wheels. Until the mid-1600s, it was mostly sold regionally. But then there was a terrible cattle blight in East Anglia, and suddenly demand for Cheshire cheese skyrocketed. The volumes sold in London doubled and tripled every decade between the 1660s and the early 1700s. But the London cheesemongers were used to handling the big East Anglian cheeses, which were often as much as a foot tall, and they were less excited about the logistics of managing lots of smaller cheeses. Also, the greater distance to Cheshire, it was 2 weeks by sea rather than 2 or 3 days from East Anglia, meant that their supply flow tended to be kind of lumpy, especially in the winter when there were storms. So they wanted cheeses that could sit around for a while if need be, without drying out too much. And wide, flat cheeses, by design, have a lot of surface area relative to the interior, so they dry out with age. So the Cheshire cheesemakers began making their cheeses taller, which was a little problematic because they were making a relatively moist cheese, and somehow needed to keep excess moisture from being trapped in the interior of the cheese and causing it to rot. So their main solution for a little while was to keep building bigger and heavier presses to go with their bigger and heavier boats. But then the folks down in Somerset, just south and west of Wales and inland from the port of Bristol, applied a new approach, possibly borrowed from the Netherlands. They would drain and then scald the curds with hot water or whey, causing the curds to shrink up and exude more whey, making the curds drier before the pot acidification step. And then they implemented what's now known as cheddaring, pressing out more of the whey. The end result was still moister than the traditionally rock-hard cheeses from East Anglia, because the individual cheddar curds were bigger, but they were drier and thus more stable than the Cheshire-type cheeses further north. Later, the cheddarmen would start dry salting the curds before pressing to better manage the acidity. Because there was less whey left in the curd to acidify during the warm phase, as compared to the Cheshire cheeses, the cheddar-type cheeses wound up slightly less sharp, with a slightly rounder flavor than their northern neighbors, which further added to their popularity. So by the late 1700s, cheddar and its neighbors such as Double Gloucester were starting to take center stage in the British cheese markets. Now there was something else going on starting in the late 1600s, the growth of the British colonies in North America. and the aggressive growth of their cheese production. The earliest British settlers in New England were mostly from Essex, and they brought with them a fair amount of dairying and cheesemaking knowledge. By the mid-1600s, the western ports of Liverpool, near Chester, and Bristol, just north of Somerset, where the town of Cheddar lies, were two of the main ports from whence British migrants set off for the North American colonies, and also key participants in the triangle trade between England, New England, and the Caribbean. Because New England was getting a regular supply of new colonists from the western British cheese-making strongholds, they also got regular updates on the latest trends and technological innovations in British cheesemaking. And so already by the late 1600s, the New Englanders were producing enough English-style cheese to outcompete the English themselves in both the southern colonies on the American mainland, as well as those in the Caribbean. By the early 1800s, American cheddars were outselling British cheddars in England, leading to a great deal of consternation among British farmers and a flurry of close attention to getting rigorously scientific about breeding animals for greater volumes of milk production, as well as greater consistency in the cheese. Now, the Americans got distracted in the 1860s by a local civil war, and that was helpful to the British cheese industry in that it reduced competitive pressure not just within Britain, but also in their overseas holdings, just as the British Empire was reaching its greatest expanse. But the U.S. Civil War didn't particularly harm New England and New York cheesemakers. They were no longer selling to the southern states, it's true. And by the way, that caused a cheese shortage in the South for the duration of the war. But as we've already discussed, armies like to feed their soldiers cheese. And the massive war effort backed by federal funds more than made up for the loss of civilian southern consumption. The relatively centralized buying and shipping to the U.S. military depots in the north probably helped reduce the cheesemakers' costs as well. Even cheesemakers as far away as California contributed to the war effort, albeit in a more indirect way. In 1864, the Mechanics Institute hosted a Technology and Innovation Expo and Fair in San Francisco, at which a big draw requiring a special bonus ticket whose proceeds benefited a soldier health and nutrition effort was an enormous 3,930-pound cheddar cheese donated by a group of cheesemakers from Santa Cruz. A special device had to be built just to be able to turn the cheese as it aged. After the fair, the cheese was cut up and auctioned off to the further benefit of the Sanitary Commission. In the last quarter of the 19th century, as germ theory took hold, scientific instrumentation began to develop, and pasteurization began to spread to industrial dairies. Dairy scientists and producers on both sides of the Atlantic began collaborating more than competing. The English and Americans between them now either directly controlled or indirectly influenced the governments of the majority of the world. And suddenly, both the military provisioning needs and the total addressable commercial market for English and American goods, including cheddar, were almost unlimited. So quality and consistency at scale became the focus of the industry on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, back sometime in the 1700s, the Americans had begun smearing the rinds of their cheeses with butter and then wrapping them with bandages to help seal in moisture and prevent the rinds from cracking in the drier, more extreme climate of North America. And they'd proven they could deliver still edible cheeses to hot, humid regions entirely unlike the climatic conditions British cheeses were originally developed for. Later, the butter on the rind was replaced with lard, and then in the 1800s, paraffin wax was invented in Germany. And soon, Dutch, British, and American cheeses were using it as an even more low-maintenance seal for cheese. And in the 20th century, aging logs of cheddar vacuum-sealed in plastic became common. And so here we arrive at the perfect cheese for high-throughput manufacturing. Once the dairy scientists of the late 19th and early 20th century worked out how to track acidity and other key variables by measuring what knowledgeable dairymaids did and documenting it all, cheeses could be made in the space of a day, and the factory didn't even need to devote space, much less time, to hours of brining and days of drying the cheese wheels. Cheddar rinds can be treated any number of ways, from careful nurturing of natural rinds to no rinds at all, without losing that recognizable cheddar taste. And that means less skilled labor is needed for aging the cheese. Curds are edible and reasonably tasty immediately. Perfectly serviceable cheddar can be sold in a couple of months. At the same time, a cheddar can also be aged for years, I've had some as old as 20, so it can be stockpiled for any number of purposes. All those traits made it the perfect government cheese. The disruptions of World War II led many countries to centralize and sometimes nationalize the production of key food items, including milk and cheese. In England, this meant that the dairies were ordered to cease production of regional cheeses of varying durability and direct all of their milk to factories dedicated to the large-scale production of a dryish cheddar following a specific standard recipe in order to ensure small but consistent rations to both the military and civilians at home. This state of affairs went on, with slight moderations, until 1954. By this time, 14 years or close to a generation later, the vast majority of small producers were no longer in the cheesemaking business. Old family cheese recipes that may have otherwise been passed down experientially were effectively lost, and many regional British cheeses nearly went extinct. Even cheddar itself had become basically a monoculture, all the former diversity within the category nearly stamped out. When the British artisan cheese industry began to revive in the 1980s, it was almost an exercise in experimental archaeology, with people poring over industry pamphlets and manuals from the early part of the 20th century, tracking down old descriptions of different cheeses, recording elders' memories of pre-World War II cheese, and then tinkering around to try and figure out how to recapture what once was. So the first thing to know, if you're looking to explore cheddar in more depth, is that artisan cheddars will be quite different in both texture and flavor than the mass-produced blocks you likely grew up with and probably use in cooking. Artisan cheddars are sometimes drier, usually more crumbly, and may not have the same kind of sharpness. Or at least they will seem less sharp because your tongue is busy also tasting flavors ranging from apple to spruce to earth to limestone depending on how it's aged. And they may not be orange. The orange color comes from a food dye called annatto, and while it's used in a variety of British cheeses, most notably Red Leicester, it isn't used in traditional English cheddar. By the way, you don't want to use an artisan-aged cheddar to make mac and cheese. It won't melt right, you'll miss all the different flavors anyway when it's mixed up with milk and flour and noodles, and you'll have spent a lot of money to make a stringy, clumpy mess. Choose the right cheddar for the job, is what I'm saying. Most mass-produced cheddars are pretty young, generally just a few months old. And most are rindless, aged in plastic sleeves for the efficiency and cost reasons I described. A bandaged wrapped cheddar will have a bit more complexity, and a natural rind cheddar will have yet more. Older cheddars, and I'm talking years old, tend to be soft and crumbly versus breaking off in pointy bits. There's sort of a sine wave of flavor over the years. The young ones mostly taste of sharpness, maybe a little bit of nuttiness. Later you'll get that range of flavors from fruit to stone that I was talking about. And then even later, those flavors will fade too, and you'll get back to a darker, more earthy kind of sharpness. If you're in the US, you'll likely need to visit a specialty cheese shop or look online to discover most of those options. But they may well make you rethink what you thought you knew about cheddar. Next time on The Curd-Verse, we'll pick up the story of modern British cheesemaking. What's happening as the nation sloughs off the lingering effects of wartime dairy necessity. So join me and a special guest next time as we once again enter The Curd-Verse.